All right, everyone's online now. I want to thank everybody for coming. Hello, good morning. My name is Chris Marty, and I'm the Vice President of Data Analytics and Executive Education at MSCI. I want to welcome you all to today's webinar, The Realities of Offshoring. Before we get started, I'd like to go over just a couple of items and make sure that you know how to participate in today's webinar. You're looking at a screenshot of the Zoom attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your computer's desktop. You're listening in using your computer's speaker system by default, but if you want to stop using your computer, if the audio isn't adjusted well enough for you, you can use the Zoom interface to dial back into the webinar. Just use the audio settings on the lower left-hand side of your screen. To minimize distractions for today's webinar, your microphone is muted and will remain muted for the entire webinar, and your camera is turned off, and that too will be turned off for the entire webinar. We do have the ability to answer your questions, and we'd like to encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. Don't wait until the Q&A session at the end. You can use the Zoom Q&A interface you'll see on this slide. And again, please ask questions at any time during the webinar. We'll answer them in the 15 to 20 minute Q&A session after the presentation. So all of that being said, I'd like now to introduce our speaker today, Elizabeth Rust. Elizabeth is a senior economist at Keybridge Research, where she focuses on macroeconomic analysis and forecasting, economic policy analysis, and economic modeling. We, in fact, use Elizabeth's services for our quarterly Momentum Monitor publications, which some of you have no doubt seen. And Keybridge Research is the author of those forecasts of metals and markets. So with all of that being said, welcome, Elizabeth. We're anxious to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. And I just wanted to start off saying that this has been a really interesting and important topic for Keybridge to research on top of the momentum monitors we produce and the general macroeconomic forecasting we do. It's something that has really affected the metals industry over the last couple of decades. And I'm happy to kind of share a lot of the preliminary research and analysis we've done. If we go to the next slide, I'll just share what the agenda is for this presentation. So first off, I'll just display a little bit the lay of the land and what has happened to metals service center shipments over the last couple of decades. One thing to note for this presentation in general and the kind of analysis this is, it's backward looking at the last couple of decades and the evolution of metal service center shipments and activity over that time. And you'll see even in a lot of the charts, a lot of the data go until 2018 or 2019. So none of this has anything to do with COVID-19, which is obviously going to affect the metal service center channel quite significantly. And we can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A and discussion at the end. But we're focused on what has been happening to metal service center shipments over the last couple of decades. So in the first part, I'll share just some facts with you on that. Then I'll walk through a few of the hypotheses we have for what might be contributing to the decline in metal service center shipments. Then in the third section, I'll talk a bit about offshoring and why offshoring, particularly to China, even more so than to other countries whose manufacturing economies have grown quite a bit, why that might be a big factor explaining the decline. So going on to the first section and onto the next slide. So if we just simply take a look at the data on metal service center shipments over the last couple of decades, we see that metal service center shipments on the whole reached a peak in the run-up to the Great Recession in 2006. And that's true for every subcomponent of metal shipments, so every metals type, although some peaked even earlier. So if we look, for example, at carbon steel, for carbon flat rolled, it peaked in 2006 and is now down 22% from its 2006 high. Meanwhile, bar, plate, and structural have been on the decline since 2001, prior to the previous recession. It's the same across metals types, but certain metals types have peaked prior to the Great Recession and others immediately prior to the Great Recession. If we go on to the next slide, one thing that's interesting to note is that while total metals service center shipments have not regained their pre-recession highs, that is not something that applies to the broader US economy. So that's part of the puzzle. As many of you know, it did take a while for the US economy to recover from the Great Recession. And if you see in the chart on the right, for GDP, it took a big dip in 2008, 2009, and took a couple of years to recover from there, but since recovered quite steadily, at least until very recently with COVID-19. For industrial production, which is similar to manufacturing GDP more or less, it's a bit more volatile. It took an even bigger dip in the Great Recession, took a little longer to recover, and then took another dip in 2015, 2016 during the oil price collapse and manufacturing recession. But it likewise has not seen the same degree of decline as metal service center shipments. So that tells us that this isn't something related to a total slowdown in economic activity in the US economy. It's something quite specific to the metals sector and to the metals service center channel. Going on to the next slide, this just wanted to kind of display the fact that this has affected most subcomponents of metals, but it's definitely been harder on steel than on aluminum. Steel has declined more in the double digits and aluminum more in the single digits since their peak in 2006. So that sort of gives the lay of the land in terms of what has happened to metal service center shipments. And if we go on to the next section, I'll run through a few of the hypotheses we have for what might be contributing to this decline. So going on to the next slide, the first that's often advanced for why metal service center shipments have not regained their pre-recession peak is the issue of supply chain consolidation. So this is some combination of mills gaining a greater share of downstream activity, OEMs creating and using their own internal supply chains, mill direct shipments to OEMs, which all generally seem to point to the possibility that metal service centers have lost some market share since the Great Recession, and that in general supply chain consolidation might explain a lot of this phenomenon. The second is the issue of steel and aluminum tariffs, the Section 232 tariffs that were put in place in early 2018. We'll talk a little bit about that and whether that may be behind some of this. Third is the issue of simply declining demand for steel and aluminum in the US economy. The idea that US GDP, so it's continued to rise as we saw in the earlier slide, but it simply uses less metal than it used to. We're a developed economy, we maybe don't build as many buildings as we used to. Related to this is the issue of material substitution. The fact that in some applications, steel is being replaced by aluminum, which is being replaced by lighter metals and carbon fibers and things of that nature. So this is simply the idea that the US economy doesn't need as much steel and aluminum as it used to, and that might be behind the metal service center shipment decline. Fourth is relatedly the issue of declining residential and non-residential construction. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but both housing and non-residential construction have been quite sluggish since the Great Recession. And so that may be behind some of this as well. And then finally, we'll talk about the evidence for offshoring being a factor behind this decline. So if we go on to the next slide, I'll touch briefly on the issues of supply chain consolidation and tariffs. So for both of these factors, they probably are playing into this quite a bit, but likely less so than the other three I talked about. It's a little bit difficult to disentangle from some of these other factors due to data limitations, but even where we have data, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that this is a big long-run factor explaining the decline in metal service center shipments. If we look, for example, at supply chain consolidation, and we consider the chart on the right, if we look at steel mill shipments by end use, so of all steel mill shipments, how much went to service centers, it's actually stayed pretty constant over the last several decades, staying within the 27 to 30% range, and even rose quite a bit in the early part of this of the chart reference period from the 80s to the 90s, which tends to suggest that, at least on the question of whether mills are shipping directly to OEMs and bypassing the service center channel, through 2016, that doesn't appear to be a big phenomenon. That's not to say that it hasn't happened more recently, and there's certainly a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest this is a more recent phenomenon, but it doesn't likely explain the long run decline, the failure to regain the peak from prior to the Great Recession. In fact, supply chain consolidation might even be an effect of service center shipments decline. When there's sort of a shrinking pie, there's going to be a tendency to consolidate. So it may actually be the opposite, more an effect than a cause. With respect to steel and aluminum tariffs, again, data limitations make this a bit difficult to assess, in large part because they haven't been in place for all that long. They went into effect 2 years ago. And even if we're starting to get in data that might allow us to evaluate what the effect of the steel and aluminum tariffs has been, there have been a lot of ongoing policy changes and legal battles that make it complicated to simply say that something big changed in March 2018 when they went into effect. In any case, it's obviously a more recent phenomenon. It doesn't explain the long run decline in metal service center shipments. So then that leads us to the other three hypotheses I talked about. So if we go on to the next slide, one is, so starting with the issue of whether the US economy simply demands less steel and aluminum. This is going to be a hypothesis we'll sort of revisit throughout this presentation, because it is definitely the case. The US does use less steel and aluminum than it used to. It doesn't explain the entire decline in metal service center shipments, but it explains some of it. So if we look, for example, at US apparent steel use of finished steel, it's down by about 20,000 metric tons since 2000. There's a little bit of an issue with apparent steel use that I'll talk about later, and what that measure does and doesn't mean. But another way to look at it is by looking at some of the figures on the right. So since 2000, US GDP has gone up 30%, but apparent steel and aluminum consumption have declined by around 20 and 50% respectively. So even though the economy has grown quite a bit in the last 20 years, metals consumption has not grown. It's in fact declined by quite a bit. So that is clearly a factor, but I'll talk a little bit about how we can disentangle that from offshoring and other factors. Going on to the next slide, this is the issue of stagnation in both residential and non-residential construction activity. This is also quite likely to be behind some of the decline in metal service center shipments. If we look at housing starts, for example, they have not come anywhere close to regaining their peak prior to 2006. If you look at that chart on the left, you'll see it kind of resembles some of the earlier charts for the metal service center shipments, which is, doesn't prove that the two are closely related, but it's a sign that there may be something going on there and some relationship there. Same for non-residential construction put in place. It has not declined by quite as much as housing. It didn't face quite as much of a bubble as housing did going into the Great Recession, but it has likewise declined or flatlined in the last few years. The chart on the right is in dollar terms, so it may even be underestimating the degree of stagnation in non-residential construction, given that asset values have increased by quite a bit. In any case, construction activity in the US economy definitely has stagnated since the Great Recession, and given that service center shipments, about 9% goes into construction, this is probably a big factor behind the decline that we're observing. Going on to the next slide, I'll just touch really briefly on why construction activity has likely been on the decline. Just a couple of interesting thoughts here. It's due to a few different factors, a lot of them likely demographic. We simply maybe don't need quite as many houses being built as we did prior to the Great Recession, which was you know, a bit of a bubble in the first place. There's the issue of an aging population and falling population growth, as well as delayed household formation. Lots of younger Americans continuing to live with their parents into their 30s. That's likely depressing demand for housing. There's an issue of housing affordability, a lot of people not being able to afford a starter home. So this is behind a lot of the stagnation in residential construction activity. And then when it comes to non-res construction activity, one big factor is falling public infrastructure spending. After the Great Recession, state and local governments, which are responsible for a lot of non-residential construction activity, face tight budgets. They're not allowed to go into debt, unlike the federal government. So we saw a pretty big decline in public construction spending as well. Going on to the next slide, I will now kind of talk a little bit about offshoring. First off, why we think offshoring might be a big factor, particularly offshoring to China, just kind of looking big picture at why we even wonder about it at all. And then walking through a little bit of the data that indicates to us that offshoring, again, particularly to China, is likely a big reason or factor behind the decline in metal service center shipments over the last 20 or so years. So going on to the next slide, I'll just walk for a few minutes through some of the reasons why economists and metals market analysts might think that China plays a big role in what has been going on over the last couple of decades. So China's economy has quadrupled its share of the global economy in the past 20 years. If you look at the chart on the right, you see a pretty big, astounding rise in China's quote unquote market share of global GDP over the last 20 years since it entered the World Trade Organization in 2001. Likewise, its export value in US dollars has soared since China joined the World Trade Organization. So we know that China has simply played a much bigger role in the global economy over the last 20 years and has exported significantly more than it used to. Going on to the next slide, I'll talk for a minute about how China achieved this economic transformation, which is probably the fastest any economy has grown in all of human history. It was a pretty astounding feat to grow by the degree that China has over the last few years. And it's used a variety of channels to stimulate domestic production in a way that other countries have not managed to on such a large scale. A lot of this occurs through sort of non-market means and strong state involvement in the economy. So even where there may not be true global demand for a lot of Chinese products due to already excess supply and low prices for a lot of these commodities, the Chinese Communist Party can continue to support these industries and their output, leading to faster and faster Chinese growth and growing Chinese market share. And they do this through manufacturing subsidies, currency management, what some people might call currency manipulation. Probably less of a factor recently, but certainly a big tool China used in the first decade of the 20th century, basically using a variety of means to keep the yuan undervalued and make Chinese exports cheaper in the global economy, as well as undercutting competitors in global markets and non-tariff barriers to keep manufactured goods from coming into China and gaining market share within the Chinese economy. There's a lot of evidence we can point to for this happening. One among many is simply low capacity utilization in a lot of Chinese commodities manufacturing industries. For most kind of normal market economies, we say that at the point that capacity utilization, so basically the amount of manufacturing capacity that's actually being used or turned on, at the point that it crosses 80%, that's a sign that there's a lot of demand for what is being produced, and that's normally what spurs expansion of capacity. But China's capacity, manufacturing capacity, has continued to expand even despite low capacity utilization. So even though there's a lot of coal and aluminum and cement and steel in the global market and prices have tended to be quite low for these commodities, China has continued to expand manufacturing capacity through the mechanisms I listed on the left. So we know that China is, achieved a really stunning economic transformation. And that's kind of a first clue to the idea that China has played a big role in global supply chains and global trade that might be behind what we're seeing in the metals sector in the United States. If we go on to the next slide, we can see the effect in steel, in the expansive growth in crude steel production that China's experienced over the last couple of decades relative to flatlining of steel production in the United States. If we go on to the next slide again, I'll start talking now. So that was kind of introducing a little bit of why we think China and offshoring in general may be behind some of the decline. In assessing to what extent that's true by really looking at the data, I need to just talk through a couple of terms. A lot of the data I'm about to walk through come from two sources. One, the World Steel Association, which obviously produces a lot of statistics on steel production and trade in the global economy, as well as the OECD's Trade and Value Added database, which covers the entire metals sector for the global economy. When we look at steel, I'll just walk through a few terms that help us disentangle offshoring from these other phenomena. So one is direct trade in steel, which pretty simple are exports and imports of semi-finished and finished steel. Then there's indirect trade in steel, which many people correctly think is an important sort of concept to consider when we wonder about whether offshoring has taken market share from the US Metal Service Center channel. These are exports and imports of steel containing goods. So things like cars, washing machines, bicycles, any kind of consumer good that contains steel that the US imports from abroad, either partly assembled or entirely assembled, and imports directly into the US economy. The World Steel Association, a lot of their data takes into account the issue of indirect trade in steel, which is really important for understanding what might have happened to the Metal Service Center channel in the US. So when we compare two different measures they talk about, one is apparent steel use, and you saw that earlier when I talked about how it's declined by about 20% in the US economy. This is sort of consumption of steel, but it only accounts for direct trade in steel. So it only accounts for the exports and imports of semi-finished and finished steel. World Steel Association comes up with another measure that is probably better for this analysis called true steel use. And this accounts for both direct trade in steel and indirect trade in steel. World Steel Association basically comes up for an estimate for how much steel is in each of these goods, like cars and washing machines, that get imported into the US economy. And they factor that into this measure called true steel use, which tells you how much steel an economy really consumes, accounting for all that indirect trade. So now that I've kind of walked through those concepts, we can look in the data in a little bit more detail and begin to show how offshoring has really likely affected the US economy and metals sector. So if we go to the next slide, we know, again, with respect to China's growth, that with the expansive growth in US steel production over the last couple of decades, that has gone hand in hand with fast growth in both direct exports and indirect exports of steel. So first of all, we know that China and also several other economies have exported a lot more cars and washing machines and everything else. So that's kind of, again, a first clue that this is likely a factor. Then if we go to the next slide, it's interesting to compare the issue of apparent steel use and true steel use and what it may say about how indirect trade in steel has likely affected the Metal Service Center channel. So If we look at apparent steel use, we see that it's down by about 17%. Earlier we saw 20%. It's slightly different estimates. And that might tell you, okay, the US economy consumes 20% less steel than it used to 20 years ago. That's the reason for declining metals activity in the United States. But if you account for all of the cars and washing machines that are getting imported into the US economy, true steel use is down by only 9%. So it's about half or half the difference. So basically, if you take into account indirect trade, it actually appears that the US doesn't, still consumes quite a bit of steel, that the decline has not been as pronounced as you might think. So that's a first clue for how much offshoring has likely mattered. If we go to the next slide, I'll walk really briefly through an alternative measure that Keybridge has come up with using the World Steel Association data. I won't walk this through in every detail. I think these slides will probably be available for you to look at after this presentation. And I'm also happy if you want to reach out to me by email, I can explain some of this in more detail. But if we take the measures of trade in steel from World Steel Association and add up kind of the terms positively associated with US metal service center shipments and subtract out the things that negatively take away from US metal service center shipments, we can come up with this alternative measure, total demand for US steel service center products. And there we see that it has declined by even more than true steel use and apparent steel use. So, on the order of 1/3, which is very, very similar to the decline that we're seeing in the metal service center data, shipments data. So this is again another clue that even though the US economy does consume less steel, maybe about 9% less steel than it did 20 years ago, the decline in demand or use of steel service center products has declined by even more due to falling market share both globally and in the United States. So this kind of gives you a relative sense of how much the two factors of declining steel consumption in the US economy matter. So that's maybe around 9%. But the decline in demand for steel service center products based on how the market has changed over the last 20 years is probably more on the order of 1/3. So that's kind of one way we've gone about disentangling these two measures. If we go on to the next slide, shifting gears a little bit, this is kind of another way to look at this data. If you found some of what I walked through earlier a little bit confusing, this may be another way of thinking about it. And this likewise shows us that offshoring has taken away US market share in metals consumption in the US economy. And China is behind most of that declining market share, not other economies. And here's the way we know that. So if we look at data from the OECD, they have a database called the Trade and Value Added database. And this looks at, in dollar terms, if we take all of the metals kind of consumed in the US economy, how much of that comes from each country. So the height of this area chart basically tells you in dollar terms how much the US economy consumes of all metals manufacturing activity. And this is all metals: steel, aluminum, titanium, all metals. So first of all, we see it declined from $255.8 billion in 2005 to $246.1 billion in 2015, which is about a 4% decline. You can compare that to the decline in true steel use, similar sort of concept, but this is for all metals. So it kind of tells you that in dollar terms, the US economy consumes 4% less in metals than it did 10 years prior to 2015. So that is definitely a factor, but then you can see what's kind of going on underneath in terms of how much each country has contributed to that metals consumption. And that's what the part on the right explains. So from 2005 to 2015, the US share declined from 65% to 60%. So you can think of that as US metals activity market share. And this is both mill activity and service centers. Meanwhile, China's share doubled from 6% to 20%. And no other countries grew by nearly as much. Most other countries just kind of held their own. If we go on to the next slide, there are a few slides I'll walk through now that dig into this on the industry level. So if we look at manufacturing, the manufacturing sector, and how much metals contributed to manufacturing consumption in terms of value added, we see something similar in terms of declining US market share relative to Chinese. One thing to keep in mind is that the change here, so it increased. So in other words, in dollar terms, manufacturing actually does consume a bit more metal than it did 10 years prior. But the market share has declined for US metals manufacturing. So it went from 58% to 54%, while China's increased from 7% to 13%. And again, we see with the other countries on the list there that most actually their market share fell or simply stayed mostly the same. You can see Mexico's increased by 1 percentage point from 3 to 4%. It's a phenomenon, but it's, it doesn't explain most of what's going on there. If we go on to the next slide, two things interesting to note here when it comes to motor vehicles. So this is the amount of metal in dollar terms going into the motor vehicles industry in the United States. One thing is that it's increased quite a lot from 2005 to 2015. So it went up by 79%. And those of you listening on this call probably have a better explanation for that than I do. But it probably has to do with simply greater sort of value and expense of the metals that are going into cars in the United States. They're becoming lighter and more expensive and maybe incorporate newer technologies. So that probably explains a lot of the rise in value added of metals in the motor vehicle sector. So this has been a really rapidly expanding pie, and the United States market share there has held its own. So we don't have this issue of kind of declining metals, US metals activity in the motor vehicles end use. But China's market share grew by more. So it went up by 5 percentage points. Mexico's went up similar to the United States by 1 percentage point. And for the rest of the world, it actually fell quite a bit. So when it comes to importing of metals that go into motor vehicles in the United States, it hasn't been so much Mexico and other countries where that's been a factor. It's, again, actually mainly China, just due to the amount of metal that China produces. But the United States has held its own. If we go on to the next slide, this industry kind of has seen exactly the opposite of what motor vehicles has seen from 2005 to 2015. You can see that their total value added of metals in computers and electrical equipment went down by 55%. A lot of this simply has to do with the fact that there's less metal going into electronics than there used to be, and or that the metals going in there got cheaper. And this is despite the fact that we obviously probably produce and consume quite a bit more in computers and electrical equipment than we used to. But there you can see a really, really stark difference in what has happened to US versus Chinese market share, where the United States declined from 46% to 28%, whereas China's grew by 22 percentage points. So this is another industry that's seen dramatic changes over the 10 years prior to 2015. And China's activity in the global economy, particularly in their manufacturing of metals and electric and electronic products containing metals, likely explain a lot of this. And then finally, if we go on to the last industry I'll cover, which is construction, which is a big end use of metal service center products and US produced metal in general. Here you can see a little bit less of a kind of shift in the country share of the market, especially considering the fact that US value added in construction, metals value added in construction has always been quite big. Construction's a more domestic industry, not quite as affected by trade, so that explains a lot of it. But even there, China's market share, in a sense, there grew quite a bit by 5 percentage points from 2005 to 2015. Meanwhile, the change in total value added declined by 22 percentage points, and that likely has to do with a lot of the stagnating construction activity in the US economy that I talked about earlier. So this is a shrinking pie of which the US has also lost a little bit of value added market share. So altogether, if you kind of consider both the World Steel Association data, where true steel use has declined a bit, but not by as much as apparent steel use, and the alternative measure that we advanced, that reveals that offshoring explains quite a bit of the decline in metal service center shipment activity. And then the OECD data, which kind of doesn't isolate the service center channel quite as well as the World Steel Association data, but it does simply show quite clearly how big of a role or how much China has increased their role in the metals sector, and how much of Chinese metal is being consumed in the US economy. The growth of that consumption from 2005 to 2015 also points toward offshoring to China being a big factor behind this decline. If we go on to the next slide, I'll simply walk through kind of the main findings that we discussed in this presentation, and then we'll open up to questions. So next slide. As I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, metal service center shipments for both steel and aluminum have not recovered from pre-recession highs. For most metals, they peaked in 2006, and the decline has been more pronounced for steel service center shipments than for aluminum. There are three big factors that probably explain most of the long run decline. So one is declining demand for steel and aluminum in the US economy, stagnating construction activity, where a lot of metal service center shipments go, and as well as offshoring of production, particularly to China. So those are likely to be the three biggest factors, with supply chain consolidation and tariffs probably playing a role as well, but maybe to a lesser extent than those other three. It is difficult to disentangle each factor. You probably got a sense from my walking through this that when you look at the data on this, it's very difficult to isolate service centers from the rest of the market, to isolate the effect of offshoring and indirect trade in steel from other factors. But when we kind of look at a few different data sources and critically examine the data, there tends to be, it tends to point to offshoring being among the biggest factors explaining the decline, if not the biggest. You can see from a lot of the data I showed earlier that declining demand for steel and aluminum in the US is a factor. It's declined by maybe about 5 to 10 percentage points or percent over the last 15 to 20 years. So that explains a lot of the decline in metal service center activity. Nonetheless, offshoring appears to be a large factor as well. Keybridge continues to follow this issue and conduct research as new data come out. I believe the OECD is planning to come out with an update to their trade database. You saw throughout that all the charts I had in there only went from 2005 to 2015. They're likely going to go back further in time when they come out with the new data release, and that will be interesting to see how much of a change might have occurred from when China joined the WTO in 2001. And if it goes further into the future up to 2018, we can see a bit what might have been happening in the last couple of years and begin to get a sense of whether supply chain consolidation or tariffs or something else might be playing an increasing role in explaining the stagnation in metal service center shipments. So hope you found this analysis interesting. And with all that, I'm happy to discuss these findings and take a few questions.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That was really interesting. We do have questions, and I'm going to take them pretty much in the order that they were asked. First question goes like this. Would you please share your thoughts on China's 2025 plan as it relates to China targeting many of the downstream manufacturers and the customers of Service Center? If they're successful, does that mean even less demand for Service Center products in the US?
Yeah, so there's been quite a bit of media reporting on the issue of Made in China 2025, which to summarize is China's campaign to expand its capacity in economic activities where it has not dominated before. So over the last 20 years, China has dominated in a lot of lower value added manufacturing activities. So simply, production of steel and other commodities, and less in the area of service centers and some of the more sort of complex layers that you can add into the manufacturing process along the way. A lot of that has to do with the fact that China's kind of lower labor costs drew a lot of manufacturing activity into the country, but it didn't necessarily have as much in the way of technological know-how and other things to add a lot of the more complex kind of services on top of the manufacturing activity. But China's economy has changed a lot in the last couple of decades, and through some combination of its own research and development, as well as IP theft and other things, has been able to kind of move up the value added curve in the manufacturing space over the last few years. One thing to keep in mind about Made in China 2025, it actually started as an internal domestic campaign, almost as a nationalist, let's really make our goods in China. Instead of, there's been actually a little bit of an issue of offshoring from China over the last couple of years, where a lot of Chinese companies have relocated to Vietnam and Thailand and other countries where labor is now even cheaper than it is in China because Chinese wages have gone up quite a bit. So to some extent, Made in China 2025 is a little bit of a bogeyman. It's sort of something that China emphasized on purpose for domestic political purposes to sort of emphasize strength of Chinese manufacturing. But that's not to say that it doesn't matter and that China isn't trying to do this. They are absolutely trying to move into new areas of the global manufacturing market. And that does pose a threat to US service centers who specialize in a lot of this higher value added activity that China hasn't before, but is trying to move into. So it's certainly going to be a factor going forward if they are successful in acting on that campaign. Their success depends on a lot of things. It depends on the continued strength of the Chinese economy, which is, of course, somewhat called into question by COVID-19 and how that plays out in China and around the world. It depends a bit on what happens with global trade policies, how much the steel and aluminum tariffs matter, and ongoing US-China trade negotiations. So we will see whether they manage to be successful, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on.
Interesting. Okay, the next question is a little bit complicated, so I'm going to try to articulate it as best I can. It has to do with two things. One, the cross-sector implications of the data that you just showed us, and also the fact that it might be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So thinking beyond the declining ASU and TSU data that you showed, and considering the implications for federal and local tax revenue declines and the increases in public welfare spending associated with the offshoring or shuttering of US manufacturing plants and the resulting unemployment, is it fair to think about how that impacts, again, the funding available or that's not available to governments to invest in public non-residential construction? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think especially when we kind of look at what is happening right now with COVID-19 and You've seen a lot of legislation that's been passed in the last several weeks, outlining federal government support for businesses across the United States, as well as expanded unemployment insurance and things along those lines. I think it's fair to ask whether that comes at the expense of government investment in things like infrastructure, which somehow never seems to get passed, despite 4+ years of talking about it.
Right.
Certainly at the federal level, the federal government, what I'm going to say sounds controversial, and then I'll qualify it. The federal government can always go into more debt, right? There's no actual limit on federal government spending. When people talk about, oh, there's not enough money for this and we don't want the debt to grow too much, that's someone expressing a worry about what the long-term implications of ever expanding national debt might be. But in the short term, the federal government can always borrow more money to carry out, to spend on what it wants to. Where a lot of the pinch comes is at the state and local level, given that state governments can't go into debt like the national government can. And so a lot of this may depend, as COVID-19 plays out, on how much the federal government is willing to and is able to get money to state and local governments, one, to help sort of, with hospital capacity and combating the virus itself, but also
Right.
with economic recovery. That's obviously being debated right now on Capitol Hill. But certainly there's a risk with everything going on that there will be kind of a de-emphasis on infrastructure spending and a lot of the other assistance, in terms of stimulating the economy that could positively affect US manufacturing activity and the metal sector and demand for metals in the US economy. So certainly something worth watching and wondering about.
Okay, interesting. Just a real quick question. The OECD charts, I think you mentioned this already, but they only showed data through 2015. And it sounded to me like we might get more recent data later this year. Is that true?
Yes, yeah, that at least that's what they say, that they are working on expanding that database to go back before 2005 into the late 90s, and then after 2015 into 2018. And hopefully they will deliver on that promise. I'll be in touch with them on that. But certainly, given that a lot of what I described in this presentation started, the breaking point was in 2001 when China entered the WTO.
Yes.
And of course, there's been quite a bit that's happened in the US and global economy since 2015. It would be very interesting to see that. So we'll be keeping an eye on it.
Yeah, agreed. It would be nice to update those charts with both the prior and the more recent data. Thanks. Here's a question about consolidation, and it's really specifically about consolidation in the U.S. service center industry. Do you think that's a factor at all in what's been happening and affects the decline in service center shipments over the last 20 years?
So as I kind of touched on at the beginning of the presentation, supply chain consolidation is probably not among the biggest factors depressing service center shipments in terms of the long run decline over the last couple of decades. As we see, sort of one way of looking at this is if we look at steel mill shipments and where they go by end use, the share that goes to service centers has not declined all that much over the last 20 years, at least until 2017, which is when we have the data go until. But it may be a more recent factor, and I've heard a bit, from members of MSCI and those in the metals sector, a lot of sort of anecdotes and just the general sense that this is a big factor. And so it's, at the point when we maybe have more recent data from the American Iron and Steel Institute, which is probably the best for looking at different parts of the metal supply chain in the US, it will be interesting to take a look at this, because my general sense is if everyone thinks it's happening, it's probably happening in some way. It may not be happening in quite the way people understand or seeing from their vantage point, but it makes it something worthy of analysis and study. So whenever we're able to kind of get more data and start to advance in time and see what's happened maybe in the last 2-3 years, that's something we'll definitely want to look into.
Yeah, because the second part of that question does kind of speak to what you just said, one thing that we haven't factored in that you guys haven't been able to look at is the effect of imports. So if distributors, especially master distributors, are trying to turn inventory faster and need more inventory to do that, or source it from other than domestic producers, that might have an impact. So something to look into. I agree. We should factor that in. Another question is, what is the future view on how Taiwan and India may impact a hopeful trend of reshoring? Are they prepared to ramp up like China has over the past few decades, or not?
Really good question, and certainly one of considerable debate among global macroeconomists and others. So I'll talk about sort of the pro and cons of that. So one is, it's true that, first of all, a lot of manufacturing capacity has shifted out of China into South and Southeast Asia over the last 5 or so years. And that's simply because a lot of those economies have developed quite a bit, but their labor remains quite cheap. And so it remains, it's becoming an increasingly attractive location for manufacturing activity in a number of industries, I believe, including metals to a great extent. India's, production of metals has grown quite a bit over the last couple of years. So there's some reason to suspect that we won't necessarily see a reshoring of US manufacturing to the United States. It's simply going to shift from China to other countries in Asia. On the other hand, there's some reason to believe that what China did is unique, and one, not easy to replicate, and two, just other countries don't have the political structure in place to do it. Remember that, one, China's big. India is also big, so we'll leave India aside for a second, but when you look at the rest of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, etc., these are smaller countries, and so anything those governments do is not going to have the same impact on the world economy that, as China. Vietnam has a somewhat similar government, authoritarian communist government as China, so in theory it could do a lot of the same things, and it is. But because it's a much smaller country, it's not going to have as big of an effect. So one is size, but then if you also consider, most countries in Asia do not have a government that involves itself so deeply and all-encompassingly in their economies that it will be difficult for them to replicate what China did. And I think that India is definitely in that category. So it's big, but it's a democracy. It's very decentralized. I don't follow Indian politics very closely, but the little I do follow, it's just hard to follow because there's a lot going on. There's so many players. It doesn't move as quickly as China's does, due to being more decentralized and democratic, even under Modi. So I think there's, overall, my sense is yes, some manufacturing capacity will simply shift to elsewhere in Southeast Asia, but there's a lot of reason to believe it won't shift wholesale from China to elsewhere in Asia, and that some may be reshored. If you add on top of that simply other reasons for reshoring, a lot of increased automation in manufacturing that makes it more cheaper to locate manufacturing capacity closer to the end use source, to COVID-19 and how that's kind of messed with global supply chains and made it more attractive to potentially relocate some manufacturing activity back home. Those are other factors that maybe add to the possibility of some of US manufacturing capacity being reshored.
Interesting. Okay. So we can't let you get away. We've got about 5 minutes left, but we can't let you get away without talking about the pandemic and the effect
Yeah.
the pandemic might have on the whole situation that we've been talking about. So let me ask the first question, and then I have a couple more if we have time. Do you anticipate any real and substantial changes to Chinese supply participation here in the US in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? And are any forms of, we're starting to see some anti-China sentiment as a result of that. Do you think that might have an effect?
Yeah, so one thing I'll sort of caveat with everything I'm going to say in the next couple of minutes about COVID-19 is the answer to every question about COVID-19 is we don't know. Just because it's one, just with respect to the virus, you know, it's a new virus and there's so much we don't know about it, but just it's so early to really assess what the effects will be. But I'll offer a couple of thoughts. I think when the virus first sprung out of China and before it had spread to the rest of the economy, I think kind of an obvious realization that a lot of manufacturers were coming to is that, you know, there's a lot of risk to having long stretched global supply chains where you're relying on one particular part from one particular manufacturer from across the world, maybe even in Wuhan, and your car is, you know, the car you're manufacturing is now sitting on the shelf because it's missing one tiny part that prevents it from going off. That seemed to be kind of a clear lesson coming out of, you know, the issue with COVID-19 when it first China. Now it's spread everywhere, and I think the implications have gotten significantly more complicated. But I do think it will lead to a general reevaluation of, you know, manufacturers around the world generally reevaluating all of their supply chains and the risk associated with relying on one single supplier for a particular good. And I think that is likely to contribute to some degree of reshoring, that it's, you know, you reduce some of that risk by being located closer to your suppliers, but not necessarily entirely. It may lead to simply more supply chain diversification. And that may, in some cases, benefit China because it remains a manufacturing powerhouse. And you may have a US-based supplier for some of your inputs, but you want to diversify and have a Chinese supplier as well. And, you know, I think it hasn't been possible to diversify along those lines given, you know, lack of standardization in terms of products being built worldwide, and you can't easily substitute one input from one supplier for another.
Right.
But may now have to change. So we will see. In terms of growing anti-Chinese sentiment, this has actually been brewing since before COVID-19, but as with many things, COVID-19 has probably accelerated it. I think in terms of kind of global geopolitics and how that affects trade policy, the jury's still out on where this will land. There is sort of brewing global backlash against China for its handling of the virus and its sort of public relations campaign thereafter, where it often kind of was very blatant and looking and trying to deflect blame for the virus and other things. That is likely to erode a lot of China's ability to get what it wants in terms of global trade policy over the next few years.
Right.
But there's a lot going on beyond that, and you know, the U.S. itself is facing a backlash from from European countries and others based on its handling of the virus and its handling of China itself. So that's also kind of remains to be seen, but it is important to follow because a lot of what happens in global trade is not just about you know, where does the cheapest good come from? It's about the policies that are put in place on a global level. And that has a lot to do with geopolitics. So something definitely worth following over the next year or so.
Okay. Well, we're out of time. Elizabeth, I want to thank you for doing this today. It's been very informative. And I want to thank everyone who is attending the webinar today for attending and spending an hour with us this morning. If you do have any questions, please contact me directly. Again, Chris Marty at MSCI. You will start receiving email this afternoon with copies of the slides from today's presentation from Elizabeth. And you'll also receive tomorrow a follow-up email with a link to a post-webinar survey in it. We'd ask that you please complete that post-webinar survey. It's only 5 questions. It's very short, but we rely on your responses to that survey to improve not just how we deliver these webinars, but the topics that we cover. And so we want to be responsive to you. So please fill out that survey and let us know what you think. There will be a recorded version of this webinar available on the MSCI website, and that'll be posted within 24 hours as well. So just to wrap up, on behalf of MSCI and on behalf of Elizabeth and Keybridge Research, thank you for joining us today. Have a safe rest of your day, and please stay well.